Welcome back to Bangkok ChitChat. Today we have an exclusive interview with an investigative journalist called Tony Davis. I'll introduce Tony in a moment, but just as a quick background, Tony Davis is a Bangkok-based security analyst and consultant with extensive field experience of a range of armed conflicts across the Asian region. He writes primarily for Jane Security and Defence. In addition, he undertakes consultancy work from international corporations and non-government organisations. He is a columnist for the Bangkok Post and Nikkei, is it Nikkei?
Nikkei Asian Review.
Nikkei Asian Review, and comments regularly on security issues for leading international media organisations. So, thank you, Tony, for joining us.
My pleasure, it's great to be here.
To understand a little bit more about you, in my research I saw you had studied Asian Studies and Chinese language at Australian National University, and then went to do a postgrad in Chinese history and revolutionary warfare at Nanking University. Why the interest in China?
That's an excellent question, and I guess it stems from the fact that my interest at school was in languages, right? And when I finished school in the UK, I had to make a decision. I'd done French and German at school, at secondary level, and I didn't want to continue studying French and German, and therefore I wanted to study another language at university. And by definition, it needed to be a language of global significance, right? Mm-hmm. So I had basically two choices. One was Arabic, and the other was Chinese. And I went for Chinese because at that time, the Cultural Revolution in China was on full guns. Mao Zedong, Little Red Book, crowds in the streets.
Did you get a Little Red Book?
I have many Little Red Books, yep, and some of them are in Chinese and some of them are in English. So yeah, getting a red book in those days was not a problem. And it was also the time when, if you recall, students were rioting on the streets of Paris, in Berlin, Kent State, Vietnam.
What year is this?
We're talking 67, 68, right? So I actually started studying Chinese a bit later, but it was against that background that I thought Chinese would be a really important global language more than Arabic. So that's why I started studying Chinese. I started in the UK at university, then I moved to the ANU, the Australian National University, and then after a couple of years there, after I finished my degree there, I had the opportunity to do postgraduate work in Nanking, in central China. And it was a fascinating experience because I went with 3 other Australian students, and initially we went to Beijing, and we'd all studied Chinese in Australia, but we spent several months at the Language Institute in Beijing basically polishing up our skills, right? So we could already read and write, but our fluency wasn't great, so we needed to do that initial period in Beijing, which we did. And then they sent us to the university where we were actually going to do studying. And we linked up with a small number of students from several other countries. We went down together from Beijing to Nanking, and we were the first group of foreigners to study, Westerners more accurately, to study in Nanking since before the Cultural Revolution, since essentially the early 60s. And yeah, it was a fascinating experience because Mao had just died, and the Cultural Revolution and everything that implied for Chinese society in terms of the regimentation, the Little Red Books, the East is Red at 5:30 a.m. on the loudspeakers, that was all still very much there. So yeah, I mean, China has been through several revolutions, and that was the end of arguably the second, right? You had the Communist Revolution in 49, then you had the Cultural Revolution in 67 to 77, and that was the time that I was there. And then you've had the opening up and the modernization revolution since then.
So, with regards to the revolutionary warfare,
what I studied was, you had a choice of things you could study, and it was a fairly limited choice, and one of them was modern Chinese history, 现代历史. And essentially, at that time in China, and probably still today, modern Chinese history is the history of the Communist Party of China. It's that simple, right? From its inception up until its glorious successes later in history. I was much more interested, given my own background, my father was in the military, this, that and the other, I was more interested in the military side of things. So I focused, with several professors who helped me in this, I focused on the revolutionary struggle of the Communist Party, right? So the split between the nationalists and the communists in 1927, the retreat to the countryside, so Mao Zedong pulled his guys out of the cities into the Jiangxi Soviet in south-central China, revolutionary struggle against the nationalists who were trying to squeeze them out, then the Long March up to the northwest of China, Shanxi, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it was all about revolutionary warfare, people's warfare.
So how did this lead on to your journalism? Because you worked for the Washington Post until 1987, and you're a correspondent and photographer for Time magazine in the fields during Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation. What was that like, and how did that influence you to continue your journalism?
I mean, I never really intended to be a journalist. I mean, there are some journalists, many of them much better journalists than I am, who were sort of born with ink on their fingers, right? I was never in that category. So for me, I could write reasonably good English, right? And journalism, when I finished in China, I'd been studying the theory of people's war. And I'm looking around Asia, and in Thailand at the time, the Communist Party of Thailand had not won its revolution. It was out in the hills. 20,000 guerrillas in the north, in the northeast, in the south, all over the country. So I'm thinking it'd be really interesting to go to Thailand and see Maoist revolutionary warfare in practice. Not the theory that I studied in Nanking, but the actual practice. What's it look like on the ground, right? So that was why I came to Thailand. And I needed to earn a living, right? And at that time, by sheer serendipity, another very well-known journalist who was in Thailand at that time, a guy called John Macbeth, had just left Asia Week. Right? There were two news magazines in Asia at that time, basically through until the end of the century. One was the Far Eastern Economic Review, which I'm sure you've heard of, and the other was Asia Week. And they were rivals, both based in Hong Kong, essentially rival organisations. So John had just had a falling out with Asia Week, right, and joined the Far Eastern Economic Review as their guy in Thailand. So Asia Week had this big hole, right? And I met some of the guys in Hong Kong before I came here, and yeah, I got a message, a call out of the blue saying, would you like to work for Asia Week? So I said, well look, I'm really here to look at the Communist Party, but that was a big part of the story in Thailand at the time. So they said, okay.
As a freelancer,
Yeah, I mean, I started off pretty much, as a freelancer. I wasn't staff, but they gave me a monthly retainer, right? Which sort of covered my rent. So, I can remember actually the first story I did for Asia Week was nothing to do with the communists. It was about Samat Sundarawet becoming the governor of Bangkok, right? So it was very much about Thai politics. But within the context of being freelance for Asia Week, that gave me enough leeway to get into what I wanted to do, which was to get out into the hills and see how the communists were doing fighting government troops in Thailand.
Okay, and then, so is this before or after you went to Afghanistan?
This was before. So I first went to Afghanistan in '81, by which time the communists in Thailand were very much on the downward slope.
Right.
You didn't need to be any sort of expert to see that revolution was not going to happen in Thailand, right? And as you probably recall, the Russians invaded Afghanistan in Christmas '79. So I'm saying to the guys at Asia Week in Hong Kong, look, send me to Afghanistan, right? This is a global story. The Soviet Union is bogged down in this country, and it's going to be a long story. So eventually they said, okay. So in the summer of '81, I got on a plane to Delhi and then took a train to Pakistan and up to Peshawar and crossed the border with some resistance fighters, mujahideen as they call it, right? And it was an interesting time because at that time, to get to northern Afghanistan, which is where I wanted to go, which is where the group that I was with was going back to, you had to walk 2 to 3 weeks to get there, right? So across the Hindu Kush.
Mm-hmm.
So I can remember, I mean, you know, I was a kid at the time and I'm with these guys and I had a little Persian, a little Dari, the language of Afghanistan in the north, but not a lot. And yeah, I'm just this lone white boy basically tagging along, right?
Why would they allow you to tag along?
Well, because they wanted publicity, which is exactly
Right.
what they got,
Yeah.
right, eventually. So yeah, the first time I went to Afghanistan, I can remember we crossed the border at the end, had to wait a long time in Pakistan for this group to come together, right? And we crossed the border right at the end of August the 31st.
So was it a crew of you or just you?
No, this was a group of them, right, going back with weapons into Afghanistan, right? From Pakistan, base area, going back into Afghanistan to fight the Russians, right? So
You tagged along.
yeah,
with
I'm
them.
going along with it, right? So, you know, I'm learning language by the day, as in, you want a drink? Yeah, well, how do you say that, right? Can I have some bread? What's the rice? All this sort of stuff. So that was sort of interesting. But I can remember the first night we were crossing this pass on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, right? 31st of August 1981. The timing was all messed up, right? So we're getting to the top of this pass as the sun is going down, and one guy steps on a butterfly mine, right? Which the Russians used to drop from helicopters. They're little things like that. And they float down and they sit on the ground. And you can't see them, and they sort of merge into the rocks very easily. So it doesn't matter whether it's day or night, you can step on one. And one guy stepped on one. So we had to stop to tend this guy. It's one of these things, it won't kill you, but it'll certainly blow most of your foot off, right? So we had to stop to take care of this guy on the top of the mountain, right? And I had a sleeping bag and, you know, a couple of changes of clothes. And I can remember putting all this stuff on and getting into the sleeping bag and not sleeping 1 minute that night. It was so fucking cold, you would not believe it, right? Right up on the top of this pass. And there was young Afghans in the group who just had a loose blanket. And these guys were moaning and crying all night. It was so damn cold. But we couldn't move because we knew we were sort of in a minefield. And we had to wait for the sun to come up the next morning. And I remember when the sun did come up, thinking, you know, I've never, the sun has never looked so good in my life. I could just feel the warmth seeping into my bones, you know. You see the sun every day, but it's under 6
So it's hot during the day and freezing at night, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really cold, really cold. So you couldn't sleep. But yeah, that was my first sort of
You couldn't
baptism.
You couldn't hunker up together? No?
No, man, I was in my sleeping bag and nobody else was getting in there with me, I promise you that.